That's stand up again. I have my background on blurred, so it just looks funny. Okay. That was a little distraction. Okay. Yeah, I'll tell you guys before I turn the camera on.
I need the Zoom link.
I think I just emailed it to you guys. If you check your emails, Jordan, do you want to come sit over here?
Sure, that's probably.
Maybe I'll move over one seat too, so that you can share Warren's presentation screen.
Okay.
Well, you can see it up there. Anyway.
I'm just gonna charge this. That should be fine.
Here. Okay, do you want to,
As far as it goes.
yeah. Okay. Okay, we'll just have to sit over this together. It's okay.
No, it's okay.
It's okay. Hmm.
Sit.
Thank you, Warren. I think that's good because you guys are going to be sharing the presentation. So Warren's is the screen that's up there.
Okay. Sounds good.
Awesome. Recording in progress.
Hmm.
You want.
Hi, Doug.
Sorry, bye, Paul.
Do you want to?
Hopefully. There we go.
We should be good.
Is that good? Okay.
Who wants to introduce?
Okay, so far, I haven't let anyone in yet. Except for Gord and Doug are here. Gord and Doug, can you hear us?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.
And hopefully it sounds a little better now then.
You sound okay?
Yeah. There was some feedback, but I think it is good now.
Okay. Awesome.
Oh, thank you. I was just gonna do that.
Okay.
Yep, I think so. Okay, so.
There's a couple slides for this. The introduction.
For me, I haven't looked at anything. So can you guys just?
You await it.
Okay,
So
okay.
the
Wow.
first couple of ones are actually.
Oh, don't worry about it. It's too late now. What time is it? 5:58. Okay, we have 2 more minutes.
So there's the first ones that are second. So the just give me a second.
But thanks.
So the first ones are just an introduction to our speakers.
Okay.
Right? And then the message is guiding message.
Mhm.
Okay, because you talked about that, and then table of contents, and then Jordan starts with the carbon.
You want me to introduce you guys?
Yeah, just to kind of like say, you know, kind of like thank you, blah blah blah.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. I guess I'll let everyone in. Okay.
So I'll hop on and use your mouse, I guess. I think it's okay.
So this is the laser pointer, and then you can just go. There, laser pointer new action.
Oh, and you just have it. Okay, amazing. Thanks.
And then this is let's go forward back. Or just Just the
There it
interviews.
is. Perfect. Okay.
Okay, well, it's 6 o'clock, so I guess we'll get started. We did actually have quite a few more people register than who's here, but we'll just have people join us along the way as they arrive, and maybe some people just couldn't quite get here on time. Actually was really pleased when I saw the registration for this event. Quite a few familiar faces, a couple past directors and people we've talked to at events over the past couple of years. So but for those who don't know me, I'm Sarah Zielman. I'm the executive director of the Sunshine Coast Community Forest. This forest carbon webinar came about because we do have one of our strategic goals set by our board of directors to explore the possibility of a carbon project. And in working towards that goal this past year, Warren Hansen, our managing forester, and Jordan Wilson, one of our directors, did UBC forestry carbon micro certificate to learn a bit more about it. In addition to that, over the course of the last 2 years, Warren has been working with the provincial association, as well as talking to consultants in industry and Ministry of Forests to learn more about that. So that's why we're here today to speak to you. So I'll let Warren and Jordan introduce themselves a little more fully.
Warren Hansen, and thank you, Sarah. We've been busy working on several different types of planning. I started with the community forest in 2021 as the managing forester operations. Introduced some EBM to the community forest. As part of that, carbon projects is a very real initiative that we've been pursuing in the last couple of years. In the meantime, we've been working on wildfire risk reduction planning and then looking at other initiatives such as partial cutting and commercial thinning in the future. So I'll be talking to you a little later in the presentation, but we have Jordan and he will continue on.
Hey everyone, so thanks for coming out tonight. Just a bit of background on myself. So my name is Jordan Wilson. I've been a director now coming up 2 years with the community forest. And I really wanted to get into it because I saw the work they were doing with ecosystem-based management. And that was a large part of my educational background at SFU. I studied biochemistry and environmental sciences, and I worked a little bit in the environmental field kind of prior to now going back to school and pursuing a master's in environmental planning. So a lot of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight are very kind of near and dear to me, and it's something I'm directly studying in my schooling. So some of the slides that we'll be mentioning and talking about are actually just coming from coursework and stuff that I've done at the university. So it'll kind of supplement what we chat about tonight. So thanks for coming out, and yeah.
Before we jump into it, just to kind of circle back to what we're trying to communicate about tonight. So we're here to share information on how forest carbon projects particularly can help mitigate global warming, and at the same time providing economic, social, and ecological benefits to the community, which is at the heart of our mission and vision at the Sunshine Coast Community Forest. Some of the topics are fairly technical at times, and for that reason, I don't think it makes sense to wait until the end of the session to have a question and answer period. But I would just ask that you raise your hand, and we will stop at least at the end of every section to answer questions, or if there are opportunities in between, we'll try to interject them when we can. So you can either drop them in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask the question as we're going through. Thank you.
So Jordan's going to guide us into the carbon science and background and carbon policy and regulations, and I will continue on with carbon project basics and how a carbon project may look like in our community forest. Take it away, Jordan.
Okay, so. Sorry. Okay, so probably the most complicated slide to start us off with, but what we're looking at here is the last 800,000 years of global, not global warming, but just how the temperature fluctuation has occurred over the last 800,000 years. This is the kind of slide that helps explain why global warming is real. What is our motivation for even thinking about a carbon project in the first place? Like, why would we even considering this? And so you'll kind of see in the cursor where 0 is. This isn't actually today. This is the start of the Industrial Revolution. We're looking around 1850 here. So this is around, a little under 200 years ago. And you'll see parts per million of CO2 on the side here. And where the red line is, you're looking at about 280 parts per million, or 280 molecules of CO2 per a certain area in the atmosphere at that time. So then if we skip and we look at where we kind of are today, we're quite a bit higher, right? And this exact slide, this exact graph has been kind of used to illustrate, global warming. I feel like everyone who's here understands that global warming, it is real, but this is sort of that confirmation that we are outside of the natural variation and natural temperature trend of the last 800,000 years. And in fact, we haven't seen this amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere in the last 3 to 4 million years, which is largely contributed by anthropogenic effects or human effects. So that's kind of our motivation for, why we'd want to maybe tackle a carbon project at all, period. And this graph just kind of shows that in a bit more resolution. So it shows you've got your roughly 1850 start date, 20th century, and then it's just skyrocketed, and we're at closer to 423, 425 today. So, that kind of frames our motivation here. And then just to give you a bit of background on the science and a bit of background on, what is global warming? What is carbon dioxide? Why are we talking about these things? Why is this important? So we'll just kind of touch on the greenhouse gas effects. And what that is basically is you've got your atmosphere, you've got your clouds and gases that make up your atmosphere, and you've got solar radiation coming in from the sun. Now, a lot of that radiation will pierce through the atmosphere and be absorbed by the Earth, and then some will be reflected. On the other side of the picture here, you've just got radiation emitting from the Earth. Now, this radiation is partly reflected back from the sun. It's also just energy that our Earth naturally releases anyways. And it's normally in this kind of natural equilibrium of releasing from the Earth, being absorbed by our atmosphere, some being casted out to space, some being re-emitted back to Earth. But it's this that is out of balance right now. It's this that we have too many of these, what are called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that are like a blanket sitting over Earth and trapping too much of this radiation, causing this global warming. Which kind of leads us into the next slide, which is, what are greenhouse gases? What are they actually made up of? I feel like we hear that term a lot and it never really gets broken down. These are basically the mix of greenhouse gases and greenhouse effects that will cause this warming and this radiation to stay trapped in Earth's atmosphere. The main contributor here, what this graph is showing, is the main contributor to all of these anthropogenic human-caused greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. Reason being is carbon dioxide is the most produced greenhouse gas by humans. And in fact, it absorbs at rates almost the highest of any greenhouse gas. It absorbs more radiation reflected back into the atmosphere compared to other gases. A few absorb more, such as you've got nitrous oxides and methane, but it's the fact that carbon dioxide absorbs a lot of radiation and it stays in the atmosphere for a really long time, where some of those other gases we don't worry about as much because they just disintegrate and they go away relatively quickly. Carbon dioxide can stay up there for up to 1,000 years even. So it's a massive problem. Even if we were to shut down all emissions today, you're going to have a lot of that CO2 maintained in that atmosphere for close to a millennium, possibly. So just kind of building on what I just mentioned there, this slide breaks down a bit more what is carbon dioxide. And just some of the things that we should be concerned and thinking about when we're talking about that greenhouse gas being, stays in the atmosphere for 50 to 1,000 years. It's produced by burning of gasoline and fossil fuels, and it's mainly the greenhouse gas we're concerned about, and the one we can control a lot. Thanks, Warren. Mainly the one that we can control a lot and bring down and sequester and hopefully mitigate the effects there of global warming. But how does this pertain to forestry? Why should we be concerned about this at all for forestry? What can we do? The forest carbon cycle contributes a lot to this global warming, this carbon sequestering, the carbon cycle period. In fact, it doesn't say this on this graph, but just land forestry makes up, I believe it's around 30% of the storage capacity on Earth for carbon. It's a large amount. The ocean contains a lot too, but carbon from forestry is something that we can easily control through changes in our practices and have this large effect. So, this graph just kind of shows where are we emitting carbon in forestry. Carbon's released through just trees respiring, just exhaling carbon. It's also produced by burning and insects, mortality, wildfire. I mean, the wildfires in BC last year contributed more carbon dioxide pollution than all other human activities in BC for that same year. So this is a massive thing we should be concerned about and trying to harness and fix. So then just kind of diving into a little bit more detail on, this slide actually helps set up what a carbon project might be focused on. Okay, that's great. Forests sequester carbon, that can contribute a lot to the reduction in global warming, but what in a forest kind of allows us to do that? And the main things I just want to point to on this are that the storage and the sequestration potential. So the majority of carbon in forests is just stored in soil. So when you think of like tree canopy cover, ground cover, even in gardening, forget forestry for a minute, but just even in your own gardens, covering soil, protecting that carbon that's in there, you're protecting and helping build that storage capacity of the soil, as well as you've got the above ground biomass and other factors that help store that carbon. Now, kind of complementing that is the sequestration part. So not just storing it, but actually drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. That's mostly done through above ground live biomass. So you're thinking like leaves, trees, things that are living in above the ground that actually contact the atmosphere and contact the carbon dioxide and help pull it down and then store it in the soil. So that's kind of the mechanics behind that. And then to kind of close out the carbon science background section, this is just a bit of an optimistic slide, a bit of a kind of ending on hopefully a high note. This paper was released last fall, and what it's basically showing is the potential of forests to store carbon and store carbon dioxide. What it showed is that the forests have a potential to store something along the lines of 300 gigatons of carbon per year. And to put that into kind of perspective, that number, that 300 storage potential, is 6 times what we emit every single year on Earth. So forests on the Earth, if they were returned to natural capacity, obviously have a large potential to store. But what I thought was cool with this is Canada's potential down here. It's kind of an argument to say that, it's kind of an argument against, why should Canada necessarily be concerned about carbon emissions, seeing as in relation to other countries, we emit so little. And we do in relation to the global kind of picture, but we could contribute so much to the solution. We could contribute almost 13 gigatons of carbon, which when you do the math, equates to the storing of the yearly amount of carbon emissions on Earth, period. Canada can store that amount of carbon just in its forests. So this just kind of like opens the door to say, okay, maybe, there's a large window here to look at a carbon project. And that's actually something this paper pointed to, is motivation for these countries that have the capacity to do carbon projects, such as Canada and the United States, to look at doing those and trying to contribute to this carbon sequestration solution for global warming. So that's a ton of information. So Are there any questions and comments so far?
Have any in the chat here?
Nothing in the chat.
That was just me.
Okay. Okay,
Okay, no, it doesn't.
nothing so far. Okay.
All right, we'll keep on going.
Okay, so trucking on here. So that's the science background for our carbon projects. Now we're going to kind of talk about the policy and regulation that will ultimately guide and kind of regulate what a carbon project would look like in BC or for our community forest. And we'll just pause here. Okay, so this is just building off of the last slide. So we're gonna walk through 3 different tiers of policy that pertain to carbon projects. But to kind of start that, this is sort of building off that last slide I talked about when I said Canada has the potential to sequester 12.8 gigatons of carbon. The conversion rate is, this is how much we're emitting every single year here, where you've got 54 billion tons of CO2. So per year, Canada has the potential to store this just in our forests if they were returned to natural state. As unrealistic as that might be, it just kind of gives you a bit of hope to say, yeah, we can be a big part of this solution. And it's also the motivation for the Paris Agreement, kind of forming our first layer of policy, being the international policy. So the Paris Agreement, Canada has signed on to it. To boil it down, is basically saying we need to get down to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we need to be there by, Warren, is it 2100?
2100.
2100. We need to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius if we want to have any hope of mitigating and kind of getting through a climate change period. So this is a lot of information. So to kind of walk it through from top to bottom, what these graphs are showing is you've got the Paris Agreement here. Now, this green line indicates what is consistent with the Paris Agreement policies and targets, and what countries should be following their policy pathways, so to speak, in order to reach the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. The other lines, we'll start at the top here, indicate for, this is global, by the way, indicate what on average current global policies and actions are currently doing. So current policies and actions are only going to get us to 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. And even 2030 targets alone globally are really only get us to 2.5 degrees Celsius. So there's quite a window here, even in optimistic modeling scenarios, where by 2030, we've got this gap that we need to address and is not consistent on global policy scales with meeting the Paris Agreement. And this just goes into it in a bit more detail, and it highlights you've got the different policies and pledges, and are they compatible with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees? So there's a policy gap. There needs, it's what's currently being done is not in accordance with the Paris Agreement that Canada signed on to. And to dive into that in a bit more detail, the Global Climate Tracker model, I believe. Yeah, climate action tracker model.
That's right.
This looks at Canada's current progress towards the Paris Agreement. So just for Canada, how are we doing? It's not great. It's not good so far. To just kind of boil this slide down into a couple of sentences, our targets and our policies and actions are almost sufficient and highly insufficient. Our policies and actions currently won't get us to the Paris Agreement targets, and certainly won't get us there and compared to global standards. And our financing for getting us there, period, isn't there. We don't have the correct amount of carbon financing to get us to that 1.5 degrees Celsius.
There's a lot going on information in this slide, but basically policies and actions is saying that Canada's on target to have 4 to 5 degrees above 2007 levels at 2100. And where we're at right now with the world is 1.3. So since 2007, the average world temperatures have increased by 1.3 degrees. And our target is to stay at 1.5 degrees at the end of 2020, at end of 2100. So obviously that we're not even close to making those targets. We're on a track right now to make about 4 degrees and 4 degrees above 2007 levels. So 2100, if we're averaging, the world temperature is averaging 15 degrees, will be 19, and that'll be average for the world. And so what Canada has are these policies where they say, at the end of 2050, we'll have 50% cut in emissions by 2050. Say, for instance, as an example, and those are nationally determined contributions towards meeting the Paris Accord. So there's a lot of things going on there. Canada ranks basically, out of all the countries that have signed on to the agreement, Canada ranks 58th out of like 62 or something. So
to build on that too, I mean, I don't believe there's any country in the world currently meeting 100% of the targets in the Paris
there's no
Agreement.
country in the world.
So there's a lot to do.
Yeah. National policy.
National policy. So this is basically what we're doing. Canada's main tool for reducing our carbon emissions is pricing it. And then that's a common policy tool used globally. What this slide is kind of indicating is what that pricing looks like on a province to province basis. So it's called the national benchmark, or the federal system, the federal output based policy, carbon pricing policy. What it is basically it taxes industrial uses of carbon. But if a province such as BC, Northwest Territories, or Quebec has their own carbon pricing system that meets the amount of carbon sequestered by the national policy and exceeds it, then the government of Canada basically just says, BC, you follow your own policy because it exceeds our national benchmark. And that's all this is saying. So the point of this slide is to say that the federal carbon policy doesn't apply to BC. We use our own carbon pricing, our own carbon taxing to follow. And what that is covered under the Climate Change Accountability Act, which basically uses 2007 as the kind of the baseline scenario and targeting 2007 carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and gives goals by 2025, 40% reductions of 2007 levels by 2030, and et cetera, to 2050. We're wanting to reduce 80% of our emissions compared to 2007 levels. Did you want to add anything to that? Or
nope.
Oh, I thought you were. Okay. And then in a bit more detail, how do we do that is largely through the BC carbon tax. And as of April 1st, 2021, the tax rate is $45 per ton of carbon dioxide, and increasing annually by $5. So that's the main tool that the province of BC is using, and it's something when we're designing a carbon project have to be aware of and are ultimately regulated by.
Yeah.
And specific to the forest sector, and specific to if we were to make a carbon project, what would we have to be accountable to? What's guiding the construction of such a project? And that's the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol version 2, which is in draft form. And this basically instructs forest carbon projects on how to quantify the greenhouse gases, and how to conduct our verification, validation studies, and ultimately develop the plan so that we're actually sequestering the amount of carbon that we say we're sequestering, and we're accountable to our regulating body. A little bit of extra information in here, just if anyone was curious, but this is ultimately guided by the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Control Regulation, and we would have to meet this standard. We would have to meet this protocol, rather, in order to sell our carbon credits on the BC Carbon Registry, which we'll get into a bit more detail sort of later in the presentation. But this slide is basically to just say that this is what we would be accountable to if we were to undertake a carbon project. And that's basically the regulation and policy in a nutshell as it pertains to a potential carbon project for us. So any questions or comments or anything? Someone typing?
No,
No?
no question. We have a raised hand. Go ahead, Suzanne, I'm presuming.
Sorry if my internet's a little wobbly. I'm curious about the FCOP. So it's in draft form.
Mhm.
And so have you looked at it? Have you reviewed it? Do you feel like you understand it? Do they have any comments?
Yeah,
Do you have-
I I read a lot of it last night, Suzanne.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, they have another section. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but they have like a results of their public engagement. There was like 14 highlights that were talked about and needed to go back in order to properly review the protocol. And a lot of it was around additionality and what counts as additional. And I think Warren touches on that a little bit in his section, but there was concerns around in FCOP. In order to be a legitimate carbon project, what you sequester needs to be additional to what current policy regulation is telling you to do. Otherwise, you're just meeting what's currently there. And if someone buys your credits and continues to pollute, they're polluting up here and you're already regulated to sequester this much. So you need to provide a project that sequesters this much and is additional to what's currently mandating you. And the current the current draft of FCOP 2 had some issues, I believe, with that policy around that. That was my main takeaway. There were like 14 other highlights that came out of that. So I mean, we'll see what the BC government does with it.
And I think a lot of the BC government's regulatory changes, the introductions to FERPA and the changes to FERPA really will feed into what that additionality will look like in the future. You know, when they drafted the Great Bear Rainforest, which has its own carbon project, they provided, you know, different, like its own land use order that provided some certainty around that, what that additionality could look like. So, you know, there's a bunch of other things that went into the Great Bear Rainforest, obviously with conservation financing, but I think it's a bit of a statement of flux. Also, I'll get into a little bit further into some of the regulatory changes and what it means. You know, when we're going to be using FCOP. So if we were to sell FCOP carbon credits, there's a compliance market. So the government we have to follow FCOP in order to sell carbon credits, say, to the BC government or other developers out there. If we wanted to go to a voluntary market where we go to you know, Shell Canada or Shell United States might be buying carbon credits on the voluntary market, we may be able to sell through the voluntary market. So, and we don't need to use FCOP in that. We would need to use another standard. But FCOP right now is modeled on top of the typical standards that are out there. VERA, DCS, and then I think there's a conservation, community and biodiversity standard as well. So they're all kind of very, very similar. But you know, it's like pick a standard and it just depends on who we plan to sell to in the future.
Did that kind of answer your question, Suzanne, or what else? Did you have other thoughts?
No, I just wanted to get a sense of where you guys are at and how much you're digging into it. So that really did. It's good to hear that, like, you're looking at the different standards and asking these questions. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one really quick thing because Warren will also touch on this, but I think another motivator for us to say enroll in the FCOP program other than selling elsewhere is because it is a little bit more lucrative. You can get a bit more for your carbon credits through that compliance market. I won't get into more on it because Warren will talk about it, but that's kind of another motivation to look at that route. And that's it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Suzanne. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the carbon project basics, and you have to talk about a little bit about the carbon offsets. And there's a kind of a carbon offset credit, that accountants you would use for, what exactly it means. But really, and what, I was like, I need to find some way of simplifying it. And I kind of went into ChatGPT, popped it in there, and I said, simplify, simplify, simplify. And then it'd be basically, and then it came back to say, you do something that's adding pollution like a car, you balance it out by doing something good for the environment, like planting trees. So it's like, you polluted it, but then you're making up for it for something that you're doing. And on an industrial level, offsets are that you're doing something for the environment, you're sequestering carbon, you're doing improved forest management, you're planting trees where you have where never used to have trees, and down that's sequestering carbon. And so you can calculate that and say, I got a ton of carbon that I'm able to sell. Who wants to buy it? And so there's a that carbon offsets is a market-based unit that we can sell. So in the nutshell, that's kind of what it means. So it's really there's basically the cycle works like there's a company A needs to meet its emissions cap, and so that emissions cap is a regulatory requirement from government. And so that's where you see these policies that you're seeing from either BC or you're seeing Alberta, or the federal government is saying that, this is the emissions that you need to meet. And so if anything over that, you need to do something different with it. And in BC, it's a little different. They have like a carbon tax where along the supply chain, that company might be using carbon products like fossil fuels or gas or something like that. They're going to pay more in carbon taxes. And so the government takes that and they say, okay, I'm going to provide incentives back to us, say, for instance, for growing, like buying food, say, for instance, right? So we have food producers that use gas to heat their greenhouses in order to buy tomato or grow tomatoes. We buy the tomatoes at a premium, but we get maybe some carbon tax offsets through or we get checks in the mail every quarter or something like that for people who are low income. So that's other ways. There's also, alternative choices for getting people on bikes. You'll see some other sort of tax incentives that allow, BC Hydro is going to, is doing a lot of, clean energy. So there's a lot of policies that are around that. That's BC. Anyway, so the carbon offsets are then, and so we have carbon offsets are projects that are developed by people that could have, like, they're planting, I was saying before, afforestation, where you're taking an agricultural field that was stripped of trees a long time ago, and now you're planting it and it's sequestering carbon. Or we're doing, we're setting aside areas for conservation, as in the Great Bear Rainforest. And then we have verifiers that go in and say, hey, yeah, you have a unit of carbon, a ton of carbon that you're going to sequester. And we're going to take that ton of carbon and we're going to sell it back to this company that needs to meet its emissions cap. So that's the market trade in a nutshell for that. So This is carbon markets. There's a lot of information on this slide, but basically there's two types of markets. There's the voluntary market, and that's typically companies that have environment, social governance, ESG, that they're looking at investing some of their money because their investors or their shareholders are looking for them to have responsible to be responsible for the environment. Say, for instance, their cement plant and their whole product is they're one of the largest. They're a big emitter, say in Canada, United States, and there's no way that they're going to be able to do something. And so sometimes they can go and say, hey, look, we can buy your ton of carbon, and we're willing to pay a certain price for it. That market's typically fairly low, between $5 to $15 a ton. And then the compliance market is the big one, and that's usually the financing is provided by government. It's where taxes get allocated. So then, they'll charge, if you over your emissions cap, then you might be charged at $150 a ton for your carbon emissions. And then you can offset that through buying compliance. You can buy a carbon credit that satisfies that. So that's kind of the compliance market side. In BC, it's a little bit different. The only by policy, BC government is required to buy carbon offsets. Everyone else is paying carbon tax and then using incentives from government to be able to either improve technology, funding requirements. Like I don't know if you've heard in some of those areas, but in, say, the Sunshine Coast, we're allowed to get funding from the carbon taxes to not burn, and then grind our piles and bring it to a green waste facility. So there's incentives that we haven't done that yet, but we're looking at funding in that regard. But it's something that allows those companies to as an avenue to be able to tap into that carbon tax and being able to offset, say, slash burning. So Ian, greenhouse gases is like Fortis or some LNG refineries, cement plants are looking at trying to make sure that they're bringing down their emissions by technology.
Really quick, just there was a bit of new regulation passed too for those types of industry Warren just mentioned. If they do emit over 10,000 tons of greenhouse gases every year, they are required to purchase offsets or reduce their emissions. So the government is getting more stringent on that, which then opens up the compliance market for us to kind of walk into.
Yeah. So as it pertains to a carbon project for forestry, there's really four, or actually three avenues that we can use to provide to have carbon projects. Afforestation, which we talked about, planting fields, and then reforestation, so it's tree planting in, like, say, we're planting roads, or we're planting other projects or other projects that may have a wildfire. Say, for instance, then we go in and we plant, say, a wildfire area. It's not necessarily applicable here, but in the interior, we had 1 million hectares burn in BC last year, and there's no way that we're going to be doing any that Canada or BC is going to be reforesting that anytime soon. So there's kind of some avenues that you can have a carbon project around that. Avoided conversion, and it's really just, is a lot of, and it's more applicable to the tropical rainforests, where you see things in Brazil where they have forests that are being clear cut and then converted to beef, to agriculture. Some of the largest emissions in our world and global and in the globe is that we have that conversion happening on a regular basis in large swaths where tropical rainforests are being cut and then converted to beef pasture. And the last one, but not least, is the most applicable to us is the conservation and improved forest management. And we'll be looking at some case studies about what that looks like. But an example is Great Barrier Rainforest, which has an ecosystem-based management model that has 30% being set aside in reserves as conservation. And then they have improved forest management, which is including reduced harvests like such as extended rotation. They have bigger buffers, partial cutting, a little bit more thinning, things like that. So that's something that's a possible carbon project as well. And then I put this. I was trying to find something that we can succintly what are the steps to getting a carbon project, and it's like not so easy. So it's like not so easy steps in getting one, and it's there's a lot of stopgap mechanisms like feasibility and project development and trying to in sort of helping to guide, like there's verification and validation. There's the atmospheric benefits agreement with First Nations. There's the lot of moving parts. So needless to say, having a carbon project is actually quite expensive. And so you need a substantially large amount of land in order to make that work. And so, that's kind of where the step one is to do a pre-feasibility assessment on, bringing someone in to go through model your forest and being able to be able to say, yes, you have one, just based on these numbers, that you'll have enough carbon price, you'll have enough money made from carbon on the carbon market in order to pay for the commitments that you'll say that you're going to do, such as no slash burning, or you're going to reforest your roads or rehab your roads, and you're going to be doing extended rotation and reduced harvesting. So those are some information. It's a very complex process. If anybody's read FCOP 2.0 and probably 2.1 in the future, I think it's kind of it's one of those things, and we'll get a little bit down that road about what it could look like for our community forests. So we have our own community forest. We have a community forest here in BC, the only one. It's the Chuckamus Community Forest. It's located in Whistler, and it's a joint venture of two First Nations, Squamish and the Lillooet Nation, as well as the resort municipality of Whistler. And they have 33,000 hectares, and they have they sell about it's about 10,000 tons a year. And I just kind of like they first started off with an ecosystem-based management plan. And then from that, they were able to have a carbon project from that plan. About half their lands are protected for forest ecosystems as well. And I think and so they have like reduced harvest volumes, extended rotations. They have expanded reserves, and they protect old growth. as well as wildlife habitat. And then so that where Jordan was talking about the voluntary actions surpass regulatory requirements, that's the additionality. So it has to be additional to what your base case, what your current regulatory regime is, that other say forest companies would be managing on the same land base. And so for us, we've been, let's talk a little bit about Cheakamus still. So they protect old growth. They've moved to smaller blocks. They have bigger buffers, and they have habitat where where they have cultural interests, large riparian areas, protected wildlife habitat, and it's also too. They also do it in balance with their harvesting, and of course, tourism and recreation is a big driver in the Whistler corridor. So, and that's paramount for them as well. Their project's registered under the FCOP, which is for the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol. For those people who don't know, it's FCOP 1, and so then now that was initially in place, the first part, but I think 2012 onwards, and if anybody was going to do a carbon project for a community forest today, we'd be using FCOP 2, which is substantially different. And here they basically cut their harvest in half, but still maintaining livelihoods, and maintaining a staff of one there, as well as numerous service providers. Just to we were able to get some of their carbon revenue data over the last since 2016, and they've were able to sell $1 million worth of credits over that time period. So to recap, they sell 10,000 tons a year. Their forestry practices are guided by their ecosystem-based management plan. They have their actions exceed regulatory and management standards, as well as their offset revenue funds their monitoring. They do wildfire risk reduction. They improve recreation, fire, and they have climate strategies as well. That's a lot of information for that basic carbon offset thing. But yeah, does anybody have any questions?
So we do have a question it's from a few slides back, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow.
Yeah.
So in the context of the World Bank pushing emerging economies to grow, do you believe that a carbon market solution is going to work?
What's the context for that question? Like in relation, like going to work for who? I think the World Bank, as far as in accordance with things the World Bank has come out and stated, I think a carbon project is in accordance with statements from the World Bank. I'm just not sure what
they posted a link, but it's a bit more than maybe what we'll get into now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Do you think a market-based solution is actually going to solve the climate?
I'm sorry, you'll have to speak up. You're very faint. We can't hear you well.
I don't know. I said, do you think a market-based solution is going to solve the climate crisis? I understand how you can sell credits and get some revenue, but is it going to actually work? That was the question.
Well, I can speak that this isn't about solving the climate crisis. This is one partial solution to it. I think with the carbon project, you're never going to fix climate change through a carbon project. You can certainly contribute to the global reduction in CO2, which will help mitigate climate change. And you can certainly help mitigate local climate change effects, and which would even contribute to something as simple, or not as simple, but something as relevant as like ocean acidification. A carbon project would have downstream effects on that. So no, I mean, like if you were to restore all the natural forested ecosystems, yeah, you're going to draw down carbon. But I think this even goes back into the science section. Even if the entire Earth was to go to net zero right now, we're going to have 200 years at least of global warming and 1,000 years of sea level rise to continue. So this isn't a solution for tomorrow that'll fix everything. It's a local solution that can help mitigate local effects against climate change and hopefully develop frameworks and policies for other places with less capacity to implement, so they don't have to do that on their own, such as places in third world countries. So I don't know if that quite answers the question, but it's yeah.
It does, good. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
And we have a question from Peter Moonen.
So thanks for this presentation, Warren and Jordan. Just curious, Whistler sold 10,000 tons of, so that's basically the incremental growth due to management. Is that correct? 10,000 tons of CO2, so it's about 5,000 cubic meters.
Yeah.
Actually, no, it's a little bit less than that. But so the IPCC in 2007 and 2013 and 16 and reiterated again in 2019 said that we have to grow more forest land. That is, that's largely the afforestation. We have to grow more wood on that forest land, and we have to use more wood from that forest land as the single biggest mitigation factor for climate change. Not adaptation, not reduction, but that's the single biggest mitigation factor. Throughout Europe and Scandinavia, even in the United States, they found that managed forests are much more capable of capturing CO2 than unmanaged forests. In BC, we tend to look at managed forests and say, well, gee, that's storing a lot of carbon. But if I were to look at, say, a 700-year-old forest that has 3,500 cubic meters of standing wood, that's about 5 cubic meters per hectare per year. That's not very good growth where it could be here on Elphinstone, 14, 16 cubic meters per hectare per year. So the management is really, really important if we're actually going to make a difference on carbon. Secondly, if we're not using wood, we're going to be using something else. So we may say, well, we're going to capture an additional 5,000 cubic meters of wood that we're not going to harvest for that. That 5,000 cubic meters of wood is going to be replaced by something, either harvesting from some other place in a forest that may not be, well, in Canada, it will not be as vibrant as the forest we have on the Sunshine Coast, or it's going to be an alternative material. That may completely offset the carbon benefit that we have locally. So the thing that I'm concerned about is we need to look at boundaries and times and scales of time, and it's not easy stuff. But I'm not a big fan of carbon offset credits because that just allows someone to do it, make someone else pay for it. If we can make money on that, that's fine. But I don't think carbon offsets and the credits is really a long-term viable option. We need to grow more forest, manage more forest, and use more wood.
Thanks, Peter.
Suzanne has her hand up. Suzanne, maybe a rebuttal?
Well, yeah, maybe not exactly a rebuttal, but I just kind of, as I was listening to Peter talk, I was thinking about that slide where it shows that 50% of the carbon sequestered in our forests and released through clear-cut logging is in the soils. So I just kind of wondered about the math and whether or not that's being accounted for in the Cheakamus example for.
Oh,
You said the 50.
yeah, no, I don't know about in the Cheakamus example. That's a good question, Suzanne. In fact, I'd have to go back and read through FCOP as far as like when they do their quantification, how much are they attributing to soil? Because soil is the main storage. And I think just to Peter's point a little bit, my if you want to call it a rebuttal, it's not really a rebuttal, but I think you need both, Peter. I think you need both managed and then unmanaged natural forests, because the reason managed have such a high effect is because the stage of growth rate of those trees, the biomass that is sequestering carbon, is at their highest sequestration rate in a growing forest. when you have that old growth forest, yeah, it's not sequestering as much, but it's storing that soil storing that carbon, sorry, in the soil. And the longer that carbon stays in the soil, the higher chance it remains in the soil and goes deeper down versus getting recontributed back to the atmosphere through erosion. So you need both systems. And I agree. I think carbon credits do allow for some quote unquote bad behavior to kind of exist and have people still emit. I think the reason I am encouraged by them is for me, it's an intermediate solution. It's definitely not a permanent one because, like you said, it still allows people to emit. But I think it gets us on the track and actually entices people to say, okay, maybe we should, here's another revenue option for our forest rather than just cutting trees down. Here's a revenue option and a motivator to actually conserve the forests. But I don't think it's an end means or means to an end rather. I was trying to touch on both Suzanne and Peter's point there. I don't know if that answers it fully, but
I'm not suggesting that we manage every single hectare. We've got to have protected. We recognize there's biodiversity, there's historical, cultural, all that kind of stuff. But the way things are going now, there's less forest that can be managed that is being allowed to be managed. The other aspect is that if we were to focus solely on carbon reduction, which we can't do with the forest because of a whole bunch of other values, you would harvest at the where it sort of culminates in its growth, put it into long-lived projects and replant it. But we don't do that. That was a study out of the University of Washington by Dr. Bruce Lipke. There's more from our forests than we have than carbon. So I think we recognize that. But I think what we need to do is also look at where are we spending money to get rid of carbon. The cost of chemomechanical reduction or removal is between $50 and $300 a metric ton of CO2. That's a metric ton of CO2 is in about 1 cubic meter of wood. That's the equivalent. So I think we'd be better off to have carbon revenue go into enhanced forest management, as they do in Cheakamus and here, to grow that wood. Use the stuff that isn't growing in some form. Like we've got enough areas that need to be thinned and need to be spaced to optimize the uptake, but the cost of doing that forest management is not cheap. So I think there's an opportunity for us to say, look, to whoever the government, going to chemomechanical means to remove carbon is not the optimum way to do it, but we can do that tremendously well by capturing carbon. We did some modeling with Pacific Forest Institute with Werner Kurtz over there, and a $1,000 investment on a hectare on silviculture management ends up having carbon after 40 years costing about $12 a metric ton. That's the increased growth and the carbon uptake, about $12 a metric ton, and that's pretty cost effective. So I think we need to do a better job of conveying the value of our carbon uptake in our forests through better management.
I like where you're going with that, Peter. I really do. Like, I mean, we make investment choices on managing our forests through thinning and maybe pruning or something like that. And then a lot of people are like going, well, no, it doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't, it's easier to put it in a GIC and 2% but if we added the added value of carbon to that treatment, then it starts to make sense, right? And through in justifying some of the silviculture treatments that we might be able to do is to add the carbon value to it. I like that.
So I was at the Truck Loggers Conference about a month ago, and I asked the question: if I were to invest in a self-replicating solar-powered carbon dioxide sucking machine that stored carbon and energy in a building material, would you buy it? And virtually every hand went up. And I think that we're not looking at what the forest can do, and we have to pay attention to that forest management, because we make mistakes. We can correct them. We also need the materials. So I think we can do a much better job from a governance point of view, collectively as a province, and from an allocation of places that grow wood really, really well. And Elphinstone is arguably the best tree growing land in Canada, along with Powell River and the Cowichan Valley. So we need to recognize that and use it for what it can contribute to climate.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that was good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we do have another section here, so I think maybe we should, move along. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, sounds good.
and that's me. So we talked a little bit about community forests, and right now we have one community forest that has a carbon project, and we have it's you know, it is long term. We have a 25-year forest agreement, as well as a small scale as well. And the benefits go back into the community. We have, you know, if we were to do some SWOT analysis, you know, some of our opportunities are there's, you know, future legislative changes that will help us be able to get a carbon project. There's a lot of hurdles in the way that are coming as we become and we explore having a carbon project. You know, you know, we have to be able to you know, overcome some of the hurdles in the way. And one of those hurdles is that the way FCOP and the way carbon is done is basically you have to be have a forest that can guarantee carbon offsets for 125 years, and it's that 25-year crediting period and 100 years. So over that time frame, that, you know, we're looking at, could there be a fire? Could there be insect damage? Could there be wind throw? Could there be a whole bunch of different things? And so that gets thrown into some sort of contingency pool that, you know, starts to look at that carbon project, and you know, there's a, you know, a 25% that could be lost, and so you have to put that in a reserve. So there's a lot of lawyers from the government that are thinking about that. Yeah, probably not. It can be protected over that certain period of time. Private land, yes. Crown lands, probably not, based on the political whims of if you look at our you know, where forestry was 125 years ago versus where we are today. It's you know, it's a bit stretch of the fact that the carbon credits that you apply for today and get money today will be relevant in the future, and being protected in that meter that you've offset somewhere in the future. You know, will it still be there? So there's definitely a risk in there. Legislative changes that are happening is that our community forest agreement says that we have the rights to harvest the trees. We don't own the trees. So that's another impediment that the government's trying to work through. And so they're looking at creating a new tenure specific to carbon that would be created when we get a carbon project over top of any tenure, any area-based tenure that would be created to help protect those carbon credits. So there's lots of things going on in the background. The community forests, myself, as well as Sarah, actually sit on a subcommittee working with our BC Community Forest Association, sitting with government and getting updates on how they're moving it forward. So it can happen. It's happened in the past. The Great Bear Rainforest and a couple of other ones are clear with that. Our ecosystem-based management plan goes a long way to making sure that, you know, there's some additionality into that. Some of the other changes is, you know, FERPA 2 and the government's new initiatives around protecting 30% of biodiversity, 30% of our forests for biodiversity and ecosystem health. That's also changing the playing field as well. So that's kind of like there's some angst around what that could look like because it changes the baseline. And so we have to kind of do this future feasibility analysis in order to really understand if we can have a community forest owned carbon project. One of the other things is that commercial thinning and wildfire risk reduction activities aren't considered part of FCOP. And so there are some of the comments in the past, and it's being looked at as the drafts being developed with community involvement, is that it should be part of FCOP as one of the improved forest management options. It's included in other places, such as places in Europe, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and where they do multiple thinnings in their stands, they're able to have carbon credits as well. So there's some sort of a few things there that can be looked at. One of the, you know, so we are looking at, you know, doing reductions with our EBM conservation, setting aside 30% of our forests for ecosystems. We're looking at realigning our slash burning. If we do slash burning, then it might be done in a way that we can create biochar. And we would do or send it to a greenhouse waste facility. Also to as Peter was talking about, was you know, ensuring that some of our harvested wood products are around for the long term, and looking at some you know, wood products that would be have a long life. And so who knows what they can look like, but yeah, there's you know, some other solutions. We were looking at planting. We could look at planting more, doing more thinnings, as well as improved stand management as well. So there's, you know, identifying areas of poor health, trees with poor health, looking at ecosystem reductions, wildfire risk reductions. Is one of the bigger ones is wildfire risk reductions, where you go in and you ensure that your forest won't be burnt up in the future, and so that unregulated greenhouse gases is a very real thing here in BC, and so those are the things that, you know, if we can keep those in check as well, then we can help to try to mitigate that through some forest management. There's lots of information in that people can look at. I really recommend, Jordan and I took a micro certificate for forest carbon management. Right now, the government has something called Strong Start BC. It's a grant. It's a one-time lifetime grant of $3,000 that you can take this course for free, or at least get it covered by government, by the grant. And I think it's well worth, if you're interested in forest carbon management, it's a great starting course to really understand about forest carbon. It won't teach you how to put together a carbon project. It'll just make you aware that it's going to be very expensive. But there's some really good teachers, really good where they know what they're talking about, and they bring in some great guests that can help anybody who wants a carbon project to be successful. There's Ministry of Environment has a great website on all the changes, initiatives, and policies that they have. And then Climate Action Tracker is to see how Canada's doing against the world, or how the world's doing against Canada, depends on how you describe it. And then just kind of like, there's also in the Ministry of Environment website is the kind of step-by-step ways to put together a carbon offset project in BC. And that's kind of all I have.
Before
Yeah.
we jump into questions, I wanted to, Suzanne did ask, which it might be somewhat a rhetorical question, on the slide when you were talking about the barriers, how can you sell what you don't own? And I just wanted to explain that in maybe a bit simpler terms for people who are a little less familiar. So the community forest agreement is, for one, it's a 25-year agreement. So you can think of it approximately like a lease, but it's really even less than a lease. So the agreement gives us permission to harvest trees in this area and then go in and replant it and then monitor it until those trees have grown to a certain height, and then, report to the Ministry of Forests, we've replanted the trees we harvested. Thank you very much, see you next time. And so basically, when you have these offset protocols requiring from 100-year to 125-year verification periods, you basically have, us who have a sort of very brief relationship with this area. We have a cutting permit for, and so there's a tree we're going to harvest, and instead we say, we're not going to harvest it. We'll sell some other person a carbon credit for that tree, and we're going to let it grow for 125 years. But we don't actually have the right to do that in any way. And so on that quite complicated sort of flow chart that Warren had, one of the very first things was an acronym ABA, Atmospheric Benefits Agreement. And that's basically where the one community forest that does have a carbon project, Cheakamus, has an atmospheric benefits agreement. And how that was obtained, there's a reason that no other community forest has done it since 2015. Okay. And so, and those reasons are more complex than probably I understand, and there are many. But essentially that's working out an agreement between, the community forest agreement holder and the province and the First Nations whose territory these community forests are on, where they're saying, so, we're going to manage this area differently. It's going to generate carbon credits, and who benefits from the sale of those carbon credits. So, so that's what allows them to enter into these longer term agreements, because it's not just an agreement with the community forest. The land managers are also buying into it and getting a share of it. So if you think about the political landscape since 2015, and you have a very tiny community forest tenure who's going to these tables, with First Nations and the province and saying, I'd like this agreement over this very small area. And they're really still at that time and still today, to an extent, deciding how they're going to manage the land together. So to enter into an agreement with one of the land users while they're still trying to figure out how that decision-making process even works is really just, a cart before the horse kind of situation, where so all community forests are interested in carbon projects. This is not, something that people have not been trying to do, but it's just not a point in time where the regulatory environment allows it to happen. And so Warren alluded to some changes that we're hoping will come in 2025 that kind of allow these things that feel like the right things to do to happen. So hopefully that helped a little bit. And does anyone have any questions? Okay. Oh, thank you. So John Bebbington said, thank you, and they're very complicated, and mentioned that the province is working on changing the Land Titles Act for public crown land to include Indigenous groups across the province. Will these changes affect the carbon projects? I actually just read, John, in the news, shortly after I learned about that, that the Minister of Water, Lands and Walrus basically recanted that and
Yeah.
said, we're not going to do this yet. We realized it's too soon. So, but I do think that has a role to play in how forestry is going to be managed for sure.
Yeah, I read that. I did read that myself, Sarah.
Yeah.
And so, yes, and yeah, I guess there was other groups that, got involved with that to say, hey, we need more input from other groups, I guess, to figure out what the changes would look like,
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just want to say thank you to everybody, Warren and Jordan and Sarah yourself. It's a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you,
Thanks, John.
All right.
Okay.
That was fun.
Well, thank you. Everybody have a great night, and talk to us if you have any other questions. Reach out to us anytime. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.